Did you know that this was Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman's eighth consecutive budget? Did you know that thanks to the giveaways in the union budget, 1 crore people will not have to pay taxes this year? Hello and welcome to another episode of Capital Calculus. I am your host Arvind Virmani. I have been reporting on the union budget for the last 30 years. Never before have I seen the national mood transform from despondency to feel good in the span of little over an hour that Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman took to present her eighth successive budget. The chattering classes, that is the middle classes as it were thrilled beyond expectations. But is this all there is to this year's union budget? To answer this and more, I spoke to Arvind Virmani. He is a person who's probably the most experienced in this government when it comes to making union budgets. At present, he is a member of the Niti Aayog. Previously, he has served in several capacities in which he has influenced national economic policies, including as the former Chief Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance. I began by asking Dr. Virmani, what was the economic thought driving this union budget?
So from my perspective, I'm a macroeconomist, so I focus on the overall. So one is the international background, which everybody knows. I won't go into that. But I look at it in simple terms as sustaining fast, inclusive growth. So looked at from that perspective, there are basically three themes or efforts in my view which will help do that. So the first, and these are scattered in a way across all elements which are there. So I have extracted them. And that's the way budgets are, right? So the three themes, in my view, the most important one is what I call policy reforms or structural reforms. The top one in that is the simplification and reform of the income tax. Unfortunately, because it was just announced and it's not been placed in the parliament, so people don't know what exactly in it, though the finance minister said that it will reduce the size of the act by 50. But of course, it's not just the size, it's the simplification. And I understand that people have not seen it, so they cannot comment. But I think that's going to be a major, will be once it is placed on the House. Of course, associated with that is the tax reduction, which we can discuss separately. But there are a whole bunch of regulatory-oriented things, which again, we can go into detail later. The second big thing, in my view, is something which perhaps not enough people have paid attention, which is this whole issue of education, skilling, and innovation. So again, these are scattered over the whole thing. But what is important from my perspective, everybody focuses on the high end of it, the research funds, etc. I focus really on the basics and the skilling. So I think the increasing recognition both inside the government and outside that how important basic education and skilling is. And one example of that is the ACER results which came out, which we can also discuss in this context. But the job skilling, that is the important thing. And in some sense, I have been working on this for at least 2 years, but the economic survey actually did a good job of laying it out. So I'm saying this recognition across the government is very, very important and it's reflected in the budget.
I was asking the economic thought, the kind of ideology that drove this budget. What is your sense? It is like more towards a more market-oriented economy?
Reforms, the intent for reforms has been very clear. The Prime Minister has made this clear both when he was Chief Minister and while he's been Prime Minister. But from my own experience, which you are familiar with, from the 90s reforms, etc., you always have to take account of the political environment. Good reform is not just good economics. It also has to take care of the politics, because there's no point in doing a reform and then having to backtrack, right? So timing and phasing, I put it simply, is very, very important. So, and you might remember, whenever there was a change in government, I used to say that the issues which are focused on may change, but there'll be no backtracking and the path will continue. Now, when you have a government which is elected for the third time or even second time, that will happen. The focus will change, the politics changes, but I think the intent has been there. And that is why I emphasize the first point, that I think it's coming back with a renewed vigor. I hope it continues at that place. I am not a diviner, but I think that's the good sign, that we are again trying to push up the pace of what is normally called structural reforms.
Oh, that's great news, because at least for the last 2 years, it's been relatively on the back burner after the initial burst of GST, the bank code, etc. I just want to pick on your first point you made in the opening remarks on the tax side. I think you were referring to the fact that the direct tax code will be placed by the FM in Parliament, I think this week or next week.
Yeah.
But going back to the tax concessions she announced, which is undoubtedly the big headline.
Yeah.
So besides the initial sugar high, which the entire middle class is exulting in, how do you see this playing out in the economy in terms of consumption, etc.?
Right. So let us see the economic implications. Right. So first is part of this is in a way an inflation adjustment. So economists, have been calculating inflation. If inflation rises but wages and salaries don't rise as fast, the real effective exchange rate tax rate goes up implicitly. So part of that you can see as a correction. Now, people have pointed out that maybe it's an overcorrection because these things happen periodically. So perhaps that is true, that perhaps there's and what is the reason, the economic rationale? So one is the inflation adjustment. The other is that you will recall that only last year, people forget very quickly, people were saying that the private consumption ratio is much lower than before the pandemic. Well, it has been recovering, one. Two, the rural part I had predicted a year ago would recover, that the problem was really the El Nino, and once it goes, it'll recover, and it has recovered. The urban is the part which was not that strong recovery. So what this will do is to help bring that ratio back to normal. If you think of the pre-pandemic level of the ratio of private consumption to GDP, it will bring that back. So that is a good thing, right? That was the one area which appeared to be lagging in normalization. So clearly, the second effect besides the inflation adjustment will be to help that normalization process. And of course, that means private consumption will increase and it will drive growth back to normal.
So quick follow-up, do you believe that this will boost consumption, or some of this money may go towards savings? Because like you said, they're recovering lost ground.
So absolutely, both actually. Because again, the pandemic was such an unusual event that we have to talk in little fragments. Unfortunately, I can't give you that will happen. Some people will rebuild savings which may have fallen behind because of the pandemic. Others will catch up on their consumption. So both will happen, but the overall effect will be, as I said, normalization to pre-pandemic levels of this whole consumption GDP ratio.
Okay, Dr. Virmani, there's a very important subtext to this move by the FM to lower the tax rates, which is, that the bet here is that this will spur economic activity, broaden the tax base, and encourage compliance, lesser tax evasion. So isn't this a big departure in thinking within the government?
So I would not see that in isolation, which is why I emphasize the forthcoming new Tax Act. Just to give you a background, my last act as CA in 2009 was to have a detailed presentation of the direct tax code, which was done at that time, which I, as Chief Economic Advisor, approved that code from an economic perspective. Now, it's almost a decade. You recall Finance Minister Jaitley set up a committee, etc. So I think that's a major development which perhaps is not appreciated. It's taken a long time. And the promise is that at least, one cannot say till the law is out, but at least that will move us to a much simpler code, which was needed, which everybody agrees was needed. And so this tax reduction you have to see in combination with that. Okay, so the simplification taken with the tax reduction will have the results which are being posited. The compliance burden should go down, especially for small businesses. Okay, the simplification, much of it for individuals like you and me, has been done. My income tax is almost automatic. I no longer have to keep accounts, etc. Everything is online, in a sense, TDS, etc. It's all done, almost done by the government in a way, and it tells me how much to pay. But that was not true of business. So the simplification is very important for MSMEs, and their compliance burden will go down, and their voluntary compliance.
Which means the tax base should also widen.
Absolutely. That should be one of the results. Okay. Obviously, it doesn't happen instantaneously, but what I have argued is that in the second, third year, the buoyancy of the taxes should also go up.
And going by precedent, in 2019, the FM had cut or rationalized the corporate tax rates. Right. So we haven't seen any dramatic impact on revenues. So presumably that same Laffer curve impact should play out.
So timing and phasing is very important, right? There are two arguments for that. Again, from my personal experience, I can tell you, one is that when there is a shock or a negative, we used to say crisis is too important a thing to waste, right? So one is it makes reforms easier, but on the other hand, the conditions are not right for that takeoff in buoyancy. So you have to make a judgment. So, for example, the reforms for several years after the 91 reforms, I could not detect in the data the increase in growth. So it took something like 3-4 years later, I could actually see the growth accelerating. See in a technical econometric sense. I'm not talking in a common man's language. So there is always that trade-off. So I'm explaining the corporate tax, right? It was done because it could be done, but then it'll take time to give the fruits in terms of buoyancy. Yeah.
So we can expect the same.
Yes,
to happen in income tax.
Exactly. It all depends on the conditions. I can't predict 100 because there is the global uncertainty comes in here, which is affecting the short term.
The other thing is, if we take a step back, isn't this the coming of age of the middle class in India? The headlines they have got, because earlier it was the poor, we had about 400-600 million poor. Now that share has shrunk dramatically, and the rich, of course, the HNIs are 10%. So which means this is the coming of age of the middle class, and very strong recognition in the policy framework.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So let me give you a little bit of background. This is a very important question which people have to understand, and you can help. So we know that what is now called absolute poverty, that's the standard definition, World Bank definition of poverty, which has not changed actually, was $1, $2, $4, and that dollar is adjusted for inflation. So that $1 in current terms has become $2.12 or something. It does not matter. That is a technical thing which economists will do, but it's basically the same poverty line. So which is now called the absolute poverty. So that has gone down to less than 2%. There's 100% agreement. I believe it's almost zero. It's like 1% because of we don't take account of in-kind transfers, which was our paper in the IMF, you may be knowing. So basically that absolute poverty is eliminated. So does that mean what? So if you go by old definition, all the people at the bottom are now kind of lower middle class. Okay, if they are no poor, in a manner of speaking, but they are pockets. Please don't misunderstand me. I do believe they are pockets, but they are not amenable to general policies. You have to go and find those poor and do something for them directly. So I'm not saying that there are no poor, but it's not the old style. So many of these are lower middle. So what does that mean? If you look at the $2 poverty line, the rate is about 22%. So you can either call them vulnerable, or you can say we are having now a middle class or whatever, middle income definition, and these are the new poor. Okay, but these are not the old poor. We have 1%. You can always find them. Remember, 1% of 1.4 billion is how much? Okay, it's at least 14 million people. That's the size of more than half the countries in the world. It's larger. So you can always find poor people, and you must do something about them. But it's not the old poverty. So yes, I think it is the middle class. We have to recognize whether it's the lower middle class or middle class, or you redefine them as the poor. India has changed. And this is very important, because there's no need for the old style stuff anymore. You have to think of new. And my thinking, and which is what I come back to, is you have to provide basic education and skilling. Okay? That is what they need, even if they do not understand it. That is the only way they will progress. That's the only way their wages will grow. That is where the jobs will be. Okay? So yes, we have to change our orientation.
So it's interesting. What you're saying is that this middle class which India has just acquired, is very stratified, and but on top of that, over the last decade, we have banked 45 crore people. We have now provided 50% of the households in rural India with drinking water, 100% electricity. Right. So in material circumstances, they are not the old middle class too, right? So what you're saying is to create a force multiplier here, you need to add skilling?
Very good question. There's one more point inside that which I want to elaborate. So what I was talking about is just income poverty or consumption, which is based on the money they have. But there is also public good stuff, which you just mentioned, which is very important. The budget announces that wherever it is, 75, 78, they will take it to 90%, the clean water. That is a quasi-public good. We have to do that. There is the sewage issue. Now, I think Swachh Bharat has been honestly believe, one of the greatest initiatives of this Prime Minister. But then we have to, at some point, go to the next stage, the recycling, which he has also mentioned. But these are all urban state matters. So the amount which government in Delhi can do is limited, but still we have to raise this consciousness. Recycling solid waste, recycling sewage, that whole sewage treatment system, very, very important. It will be difficult to call oneself Viksit without being Swachh, And again, you understand, you hear foreigners what they say. Nobody will believe you are Viksit unless you are a clean country in terms of sewage and solid waste.
In 2000, we were a 400 billion economy. Right. Today, we are a 3.5 trillion economy. In 2000, you had about 40% poverty in this country. Yeah. Today, you have 2% absolute poverty. Yeah. So, in 2019, you had only 5% of India, rural India, drinking water. Right. 10 years ago, 45 crore people did not have a bank account. Right. So I'm saying with all these circumstances, the economic foundation has changed. Right. So what the FM has announced, like say, giving money back to the middle class, you see that as an example. Her commitment to get rid of the regulatory cholesterol. So that's what I'm asking. Is this a new deal for a Viksit Bharat?
Yeah, the reason why I hesitate, this is a problem of being so old. When Prime Minister Modi first came into power, my judgment was that he's much more aware of this emerging middle class. Okay, but perhaps it was that the general politics was not. Okay, so you may have had that it was not done at the same pace. So you could say that in some sense it started in 2014 and it's picking up pace. Okay, Because why? Because the general public is still so focused on the issue of poverty in the old way of looking at it. Okay? And the political system, and even, I'm sorry to say, perhaps the intellectuals and the media, they are not understanding that India has changed. That doesn't mean we don't do anything for the poor and vulnerable, but you have to think in different ways. Just to give you one example, which goes back, is that instead of being a MyBop and every setting up a government hospital in every state, you give them insurance. Okay, I'm just using. We may not all agree on that matter, but I'm just trying to give an example. So like that, thinking has to change. Okay, but it starts with the recognition that $1 poverty or absolute poverty is done. Now, what are the new issues? What is the vulnerability we are talking about, right? We know 20% are vulnerable, but what is that? It's not the same old way. It's not you keep giving them doles. And I would assert, which others may not agree, that the key issue is the basic quality of education and skilling. That is the next step for this bottom 20, 30, 40. That doesn't mean we don't give them insurance. We should. Insurance is very important because there will be shocks. Everybody knows that, right? And again, if you learn from the pandemic, the shock happened, everybody depleted their savings, but obviously those who have less saving deplete them faster. I mean, this is just simple logic, right? But it's also consistent with economic thinking. So there will be shocks, and government will come in to provide them help at that time. But the big issue is quality of education and skilling.
Arvind Virmani is spot on. India has changed, and fundamentally at that. Its calling card is no longer depravity and poverty. This does not mean that it's resolved its development problem issues. Instead, it has acquired new priorities, namely education and skilling. This union budget records this watershed moment in India's economic history. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews.Tech. Hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss any updates, and please to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.